Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll just give it a little minute just so everybody can kind of come in from the waiting room and then we'll get going. Okay, so I think we'll make a start. And say some people will continue to join us as well. So thanks everybody for joining us for this is our third in the series of these webinars that are done in partnership between Groundswell, Belfast Healthy Cities, and the UK National Network. My name's Ruth Hunter. I'm one of the directors of the Groundswell Consortium, who's going to chair this one. This session's around inclusive and safe green spaces. We got a great lineup of speakers who are going to cover things from homelessness to violence against women and girls and safety, and then design and inclusive spaces for older people as well. So, really nice range of topics to cover here. Um, we're going to encourage, we've got some time at the end. So we've got three speakers who are going to speak for around 15-20 minutes each. And then we've got plenty of time then at the end for a more kind of in-depth panel discussion. So if can encourage you to use the Q&A and the chat function as we go along to pitch your questions for the speakers at the end, that would be great. So if Jackie can just stop sharing the screen, what I'll do then is hand over to our first speaker. So it's great to have Stephen Maldon with us from University of Edinburgh. Stephen's been part of the Groundswell Consortium from the start. He's one of the research fellows at the University of Edinburgh, and he's also based with the Scottish Collaboration for Public Health Research and Policy, also known as SHERP. He's got a wealth of knowledge, particularly around development and evaluation of complex public health interventions, and has been doing quite a lot of work, particularly around health inequalities, mental and physical health, and has very actively been involved in research addressing homelessness, and particularly looking at how community-based initiatives such as social prescribing can help support inclusion health. So Stephen, I'll hand over to you. Looking forward to hearing about your work.
Sure. I'm just going to quickly share my slides and hope this works. Can you see that?
Yeah. Yeah, if you just want to put it into present mode,
Presenting
that's
mode.
you.
Yep.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, thanks everyone. Very happy to be here today to talk about the Nature Health Plan, which is a green social prescribing programme specifically for people experiencing homelessness. This was a project that myself and my colleagues listed here, have been involved in over the last year or so as part of the Groundswell project. So why green health prescriptions? So this is something that's become quite popular in the social prescribing field in the last few years. We know that spending time in nature is good for our health. There's a wealth of literature out there supporting that at the moment. However, people experiencing socioeconomic deprivation have less access to green space in general, at least in the UK. And people experiencing homelessness have an even more complex relationship with nature. So, for example, obviously having been unhoused means that people are often spending time in nature by necessity. It's where they live sometimes. And we'll get on to a wee bit more about how that ties in with green social prescribing a bit later in the presentation. So green social prescribing, is it accessible to all? So currently, there's kind of build-up of literature at the moment that's demonstrating that green social prescribing is socially patterned. So essentially, it's less accessible in deprived areas, socioeconomically deprived areas, or within certain population groups. So a recent mixed methods study demonstrated that although interest in taking part in a green social prescribing programme was quite high amongst minority groups, referral rates were low across the sampled primary care practices. 95% were not referred into a green social prescribing programme. And qualitative aspects of this study highlighted that there was various context-specific barriers to this around safety. A perception that these types of programs were not for this particular group, and this was coming for the group themselves, and a lack of cultural sensitivities. So when we extrapolate that up to homelessness, these types of inequalities also extend to this population. And I should say, when we're talking about homelessness here, we're using an all-encompassing term. It's quite a heterogeneous population group. It ranges from people who are classed as sort of hidden homeless, so sofa surfing, all the way to the kind of rough sleeping, explicit homelessness that you may kind of see on the streets at night, things like that. So green social prescribing. There's distinct benefits to green social prescribing out with the wider benefits of social prescribing in general. So social prescribing there's now a wealth of research out there that shows that it's got many health and social benefits for people experiencing homelessness. So these include access to services, reduced social isolation, more appropriate healthcare use, and wellbeing improvements. However, green social prescribing theorises that there are additional benefits to the green aspect of social prescribing. These include intention restoration, stress reduction, and reduced rumination, so dwelling on negative thoughts. So population groups that may not be able to access green social prescribing may not be getting these explicit benefits that really come from the green aspect of social prescribing. And that's where the kind of inequality starts to creep in this population group. So with all this in mind, a primary care practice in Edinburgh, dedicated exclusively to people experiencing homelessness, decided to develop and implement a green social prescribing programme explicitly for people experiencing homelessness. So the access place is the primary care practice, and it's really more than a primary care practice. It's health, social work, and housing all within a one-stop shop, really. So it's a real asset for people experiencing homelessness in Edinburgh. The intervention itself incorporated 5 components. So these included an adapted RSPB calendar. So this is commonly used in social prescribing programmes for the general population. This was adapted for use with people experiencing homelessness who may have literacy issues and other issues. A big aspect of the programme was the community garden, and most of this presentation will focus on the community garden aspect of the programme. It also included nature walks, although these were stopped quite early on in the programme because they just weren't attended and weren't feasible to deliver. It also included an adapted version of branching out. So branching out is a green therapeutic programme where participants engage in kind of conservation type activities. So it could be kind of hedge clearances, tree planting, excursions to green spaces out with the city. This was adapted to be a bit more accessible, so it went to and from the practice rather than having to go out in a minibus, for example, and just took in local green spaces rather than going too far afield. And importantly, underpinning all that was a referral pathway that tied it all together and made it a kind of green social prescribing programme. It's important to acknowledge the people involved in developing the programme, so Serenians, the Edinburgh Lothians Green Space Trust, and also NHS Lothian Charity. So Groundswell got involved to evaluate the programme early on. It was felt that this was an important step to take. The programme was developed using the 6 quality steps in intervention development, 6 SQUID. There's a video link here. I won't open this up, but if anyone wants to save the link and have a look later, it's details how £6 was used to develop the programme. And so we undertook an evaluation of this green social prescribing programme in 2024 into 2025. The aim of the programme was to test the feasibility and acceptability of the Nature Health programme, bearing in mind that this was, to our knowledge, the first green social prescribing programme exclusively for people experiencing homelessness in the UK. So it was important to test the feasibility and acceptability at this stage. Included mainly qualitative methods, so we used 11 semi-structured interviews with service users, 11 with NHS staff, and 6 with service delivery staff, so 28 overall. We used a thematic analysis, and we also were informed by normalisation process theory, which, for anyone not familiar with this, it's a really useful framework for process evaluations, particularly evaluating how a new intervention integrates into routine practice, which is why we felt it important to use this. So I'm just going to briefly summarise the findings, because I haven't got too much time to go into real detail, but I'll start with the service users. So these were really, really positive in terms of interviews with the service users, and some of the things that came out were the community garden aspect of the programme was seen as a place to positively engage with others. So a lot of people had quite negative experiences in public green spaces. They felt moved on, or that they weren't welcome there, or that trouble seemed to follow when they were there. And this first quote here, I won't read it out, but it basically says that the place feels safe. They don't feel like they don't belong there, and it's just somewhere they can positively interact and let off kind of steam, which was important. An important one as well was it was an opportunity to engage with nature and associated activities. So some people highlighted that before they were homeless, they had opportunities to engage with nature in positive ways. And now that the community garden and the green social prescribing programme was accessible to them, they were able to do this again and get some of those positive benefits back that they'd been missing. An important one was some of the activities involved structured, kind of getting involved, planting things, tidying up the space, and this gave some participants a sense of purpose. So it's something they could engage with and feel that they were being worthwhile, and that what they were doing was of value to others who would visit the space. So the main kind of focus of the evaluation though was on the NHS staff and service delivery participants in the programme, and this is where we found some more contentious perceptions of the programme. So specifically, recognising where green social prescribing fits within primary care was a big one. There was an appreciation for the benefits of green social prescribing, but this was balanced against more kind of criticisms of clinical need, and within a population group such as people experiencing homelessness, obviously people do sometimes come to primary care with quite acute conditions, and it was felt that there was a mismatch in terms of a balance of GP's time in terms of being able to refer to the programme, but also deal with quite or time sensitive issues that people were presenting with. There was also some quite significant organisational and governance factors to contend with. So ownership of the space was quite an issue in terms of whose responsibility it was to oversee what was happening in the garden, and this actually put people off, a number of referrers off conducting referrals or putting people into the programme because they weren't sure what was happening once they were in the programme in terms of safety. So some of the service users of the space have additional needs that require support, and they weren't sure if this was being provided once they were referred into the programme. So this did dampen numbers in terms of the number of people who were referred in. There was a general feeling that the garden itself was a positive asset, and it was quite a rare thing to have in any primary care setting, a green space that can be used for these types of activities. So the value was appreciated by staff and service delivery staff. there was a very low uptake of things like the RSPB calendar and branching out, and a number of reasons were given for this, but mainly it was just a mix between perceptions of safety for branching out, but also time, prescribers' time and service delivery time, and also participants had other priorities. It was quite difficult to get people to commit to a structured programme. So the community garden really was the main draw. Referral pathway was a big one. So this was really kind of the thing that underpins all social prescribing programmes, was how the referral pathway works. There was conflicting kind of philosophical views around the appropriateness of nature prescriptions. Can nature be prescribed and should it be prescribed? But more importantly, with this programme, that low confidence in the governance structure that I talked about was the real kind of crux of the issue in terms of stopping people referring to the programme. It felt that there was maybe more work to be done in terms of the procedures that then take over once someone's referred and the support that they're given. This is kind of linked to the fact that the garden was viewed quite well as a drop-in, but for it to work in that way, as a low barrier drop-in service, self-referral type service, there needs to be tighter safety and initial referral procedures in place. So just to quickly summarise, although there were some barriers identified in this evaluation, we can't ignore the fact that this is a real opportunity to address the care needs beyond appointment. So an important contextual point to make is that, as I said before, a lot of people come to this practice with really acute and quite almost emergency needs, even though it's primary care and not secondary care. But they only have about a 10-minute window for an appointment. It was viewed that the garden space in particular may be an opportunity to extend some wraparound care, whereby social workers or someone who can maybe has a bit more time post-appointment can go and engage with someone who maybe didn't get the full support they needed during the appointment, and the garden was an opportunity to do that. And it could be a very important wellbeing outlet for people experiencing homelessness. So as I said, the service users were wholly positive about the programme. It's important to consider that although we found some quite stark barriers, these are very well aligned with other similar evaluations of green social prescribing. So Haywood and colleagues at Sheffield and Exeter universities found across a national evaluation of green social prescribing that very similar patterns of barriers were identified. So challenges with referral processes, limited uptake of monitoring and evaluation. So primary care and people experiencing homelessness and inclusion health it's well known to be quite intense. Burnout is quite common, so this may have played a role here. A national survey of GPs found that although knowledge was high, those who worked longer sessions were significantly less likely to view GSP as positive, green social prescribing as positive. And those with higher job satisfaction were more likely to have positive views of green social prescribing. I'll just quickly run through, I know I'm a bit over time now. So these were the recommendations we made. The really important ones were to really tighten up the governance structures around the programme, and also to include some core evaluation measures which are currently lacking beyond routine data collection linked to primary care medical records. I won't go into the logic model in detail, but we developed a logic model that's still being refined, and this will help kind of underpin the programme theory around why green social prescribing may be an appropriate intervention for people experiencing homelessness. We're also working with St Mirren's and the Access Place to integrate some health-related monitoring and evaluation. So these include things like the ONS4, personal wellbeing, and also things around things such as activation. So health confidence, how confident people who attend the programme feel in managing their own health. Next steps, Serenians received some Groundswell Innovation funding towards refinements to the community garden aspect of the Green Social Prescribing Programme, and these are currently underway at the moment. A memorandum of understanding has been established between the different agencies involved, and this has anecdotally, we've been chatting to Serenians recently, and this has anecdotally really helped in kind of a deal with some of those anxieties or questions that some staff had around the safety of the programme and the governance, which has really been useful. And Serenians are now, through their link worker and their garden coordinator, they are trying out some of these health-related evaluation measures to see if we can actually measure health-related benefits of the programme or impacts long-term. These are the references from today, and just thanks very much to everyone who's listened in today, but also to some of the people who've been integral in getting this study over the line. Thanks very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephen, and a brilliant presentation. And I appreciate a huge amount of work and work that takes a lot of time to do and to build trust with that, with the community that you're working with. And there's some things to pick up there, particularly around, you mentioned ownership of the space and the challenges of that. And I think that's something that will probably be a common theme across the different presentations today. And the other thing as well around measurement and how do you measure the impacts of these types of interventions and programs. So some things to unpick when we get to the discussion session. But thank you for that. It was a really great presentation. Okay, we'll move on, and we've got Aoife McGee next. So Aoife is a registered architect with over 20 years experience working in urban design practice, research and teaching. Her work investigates feminist architecture, gendered space and spatial urban systems. She's particularly focusing her PhD on Right to the Night for women and girls, and has a particular interest in the different engagement processes involved in the design and implementation of public space. We're very lucky to have her as one of our PhD students with Queen's and with Groundswell. So Aoife, I'll hand over to you to talk to us about some of the work that you've been doing.
Okay, thanks very much. And hello, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I'll just try to share this presentation now. Just bear with me. Share. Okay, hopefully this works. Is that okay?
Sure, yep.
Yeah, great. So I have a tendency to talk a bit fast, especially under time pressure. So please do let me know if I'm speaking too fast here, if you can't understand what I'm saying. So I'd like to talk today about some of the early considerations of the research work I'm doing at the moment on the Right to the Night. I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by that, give some context and some examples of inclusive public space engagement processes. So the urban design of our cities really stems from long-standing patriarchal power systems. These typically govern urban development, influence financial allocation, compound social inequality, and generally subjugate women. This is not accidental, but by design. When this inequity manifests itself materially in the built environment, this contributes to women's reduced access to urban space and restricted mobility, particularly at night. This impacts their right to the night. So this is an image by Her City communicating the reality of the city and its potential for improvement. This piece of research by XYX Lab called Your Ground shows that public spaces, particularly at night, limit women's involvement in the city. We can see here only 7% of women feel safe after dark. This is because these spaces are designed through a heteronormative, able-bodied male default lens that fails to account for the needs of women and girls. Caroline Criado Perez calls this data-driven invisibility. Research shows this leads to a self-imposed curfew where women restrict their movements to avoid harassment and violence in the city at night. So looking briefly at a local case study of an urban public space in North Belfast, I'd like to show you some of the spaces around Old Park and Ardoyne within 5 to 10 minutes walking distance from Marrowbone Millennium Park and playing fields, and specifically the impact of some of those design decisions on the urban experience for women and girls. This is a picture of North Belfast. After dark, some of the streets feel very dangerous. Spaces of refuge are inaccessible and mobility options are much more complex. The mental map of the city shifts according to the geographies of fear and perceived unsafety. My research is interested in methods of engagement, as Ruth mentioned, that capture lived experience and translate it into meaningful action, policy and legislation. The right to the night in this sense is considered through a radical feminist lens, suggesting that equitable urban citizenship must include a safe and meaningful presence after dark. The perceived threat in this location is in part due to the design and the material conditions of the space. And we can see here, there are no eyes on the street, dead ground level frontage, harsh lighting where it exists, and poorly maintained footpaths and roads. As Leslie Kern says, from Feminist City, this perceived threat comes at both an emotional and financial loss to women in the form of pink tax. This steals time and energy away from women through precautionary planning and safety work, limiting job opportunities, education opportunities, leisure opportunities, and generally disrupting access to public space at night. From an intersectional perspective, we know that this issue is worsened for certain women from low-income neighbourhoods, and also due to race and ethnicity. Understanding the lived experience of the nighttime is critical in this sense. In November last year, Belfast Healthy Cities ran a walking workshop, which took place to map using the Place Standard tool within the local context of a recently developed Millennium Park or Marrowbone Park. The workshop was held with teenagers and people in their early 20s, based on the prevention of violence against women and girls. This is the route we took, and the red spots are some of the hot spots. The green space that you can see there to the left-hand side of the image is Marrowbone Park. Looking back at how the park was presented at design stage to the community, here's the proposals for how the park would operate, particularly at night, with appropriate lighting, play spaces and decorative fencing. The representation of the proposal reads as a fully developed plot of land, rich with activity, a cultivated landscape with very welcoming edges. Here we can see in a bit more detail some of the more micro scale designed elements, which include the decorative fencing, shows an inclusive playground and lighting to promote use of the park at night. It should be mentioned here that the local people love this park. It's an excellent community resource, but it is worth reflecting since its most recent development to determine whether there are alternative engagement processes available that might have revealed some other design priorities. It should also be mentioned that the design statement prepared by the architects doesn't mention women, girls, or gender at all. So in terms of the reality of this space, everything here west of the pink dashed line is underdeveloped or appears like wasteland. It's very overgrown. There's lots of rubbish there. And the local perception is that money ran out. Funding can be incredibly difficult to manage on community and public projects, but it's worth acknowledging that the funding decisions made at every project stage have impact on local people and their everyday mobility in the context of the park. Methods of participatory budgeting may have addressed this issue. So looking very briefly in a bit more detail at one of the hotspots along the walking route at the back of the park, highlighted in blue here, just near the 2 terraces of housing. This is a photo standing alongside the gable end of the housing, looking towards the underdeveloped side of the park. The camera automatically brightens the image a little bit for clarity, but in reality, it felt much darker when we were there. This is that same location at the red dot. Using Tim Ingold's method of drawing as thinking through the forces at play. This was a drawing that I'd done to interrogate the material conditions of the urban experience, which facilitated a general perception of unsafety for the workshop participants around the park boundary. The dark purple here is coded as negative due to undeveloped land, dereliction, poor maintenance. The housing design in this part of the city that turns its back on to the front of other houses, so backs meet fronts, and it deters any social interaction between these everyday street spaces and creates negatively charged spaces that feel very unsafe at night. The park's undeveloped edge further exacerbates the issue. The key here shows all of the primary physical elements that host this experience. So the black is the dead frontage, which really has no passive surveillance or natural surveillance from it. The pink is the front of house, where there's a bit more opportunity to engage with the street. And the darker purple or grey spaces are the street space and the undeveloped park. So pulling apart some of the physical designed elements that contribute to the perception of threat and unsafety, we can see here on the top left, the dead frontage of the housing gables. The graffiti on the wall in pink, giving a sense of poor maintenance and subversive behaviour. Uneven paviours on the steps, which are a trip hazard. Scaffolding poles disjointed on the handrail, which do not act as an appropriate support and are non-compliant with building regulations. A dead corner, which is unnerving when it's difficult to see someone approaching. Debris and rubbish on the ground, and of course the underdeveloped aspect of the park there in green. So there is a demand for democratic planning processes which understand the diverse lived experiences and challenge inequity of access for women and girls. So how do we approach this issue? Well, radical feminism seeks to address the systemic failures and provides an alternative lens. Emerging feminist research positions co-design as a gender-responsive architectural method that can translate lived experience into spatial change. Women's diverse narratives of fear, avoidance, and adaptation are spatial data that reveal how environments function in practice. The women and girls are experts in the field of their own neighbourhood. The data used appropriately could then embolden designers to act with purpose. So looking at some examples of the application of this, here is another image from Her City mentioned at the beginning. It is a UN Habitats initiative, which identifies methods of engaging with women and girls in urban design and planning. A more positive perspective here on the future of the city when designed through a feminist lens and using a co-design process. Her City do co-design through 3 phases. The first being assessment, second design, and third implementation, using 9 building blocks. And they've developed digital engagement tools to support the whole overall process. One such one being Minecraft to make the process a bit more accessible to younger girls. Power mapping is another approach used by feminist practitioners and researchers as a tool to identify the breadth and opportunity of an issue, and is a method I'll be employing throughout my research. It is a simple XY axis with power and influence on the vertical axis and support going from least to most supportive engagement on the horizontal. This is an image from the Milan gender axis, an example of an intersectional feminist participatory process which mapped spaces in the city relevant to the participants, focusing particularly on gender-sensitive uses. It captured the lived experience in collaboration with the municipality in order to identify meaningful inclusion and direct action in the city. Another example of supportive participatory projects comes from Collectiu.6 in Barcelona, which involved women and girls in the identification of safe and unsafe parts of the city and new ways to consider these. Rather than treating participation as a procedural requirement, these examples advance co-design as a supportive knowledge-producing practice. that can challenge the male normative assumptions embedded in briefs, standard and spatial typologies. Just circling back now to North Belfast and using XYX Labs approach and a method Dr. Augustina Martira and I use in Street Space Master's of Architecture studio here in Queens to represent safe and unsafe space. This is a map which responds to the verbal accounts of the participants of the Belfast Healthy Cities Walking Workshop last year. It identifies collective reactions to specific places within a 5-minute walk of the park. The colour spectrum goes from dark purple to dark green. Dark purple is the space that feels unsafe. Pink is uncomfortable. Light green is comfortable and dark green feels safe. As we move around the map in an anti-clockwise direction, starting at Marrowbone Park, we can see how the perception of safety changes. Looking at a few of those conditions, some of the dark purple areas are due to traffic moving too fast, poorly maintained footpaths, dog poo, a lot of dog poo, difficult to cross car parks, cut-throughs in housing areas that were damp, dark and dirty. Then some of the positive aspects of the walking route show a sense of safety around active sites, accessible facilities with lots of people, well maintained, appropriately lit, important local services such as corner shops. The relevance of this as a context-specific study is that we can start to see the contradictions in the urban experience, the spaces that work and those that simply don't. The interesting threshold between the two, where these two diverging experiences meet, provide an opportunity for a redesigned threshold. These studies allow us to determine part of the role design plays in the lived experience and perception of unsafety through the eyes of the local people. Tackling violence against women and girls will not be achieved only in the redesign of our streetscapes and how our public facilities connect with these, but it can go some way to addressing inequity of access and protecting the right to the night for women and girls. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. Thanks, Aoife. Really interesting talk, and I'm keen to hear more about what you have to say, particularly around those different engagement processes and alternatives that you're thinking about, particularly to tackle and address this issue of ending violence against women and girls, particularly in public spaces. And some of the ones you mentioned there already, like using Minecraft, what XYX Lab, etc., are up to. So yeah, it'd be good to pick some of that apart in the discussion as well. So thank you for that. It was really interesting.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll move on. Hopefully Jeff is still with us. We'll move on to our last speaker then before we get into the panel discussion. So we've Jeff Green, who's a Professor Emeritus of Urban Policy at the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre at Sheffield Hallam University. I have about a page here in terms of his bio and all the things he's done, particularly with the World Health Organization. A lot of that work, particularly around age-friendly cities and communities, an area that he's still very much working in. A lot of his work has been very much at that kind of interface of local government and academia, and working strategically in the chief executive departments of 4 cities of the UK for the WHO, and a wealth of experience and publications around age-friendly cities right across Europe. So it's great to have you with us, Jeff. I think Jacqueline's going to share your slides for us, and really interested in what you've got to say about your work with age-friendly cities. So thank you. Over to you.
So thank you, Ruth, and thank you, Jacqueline, for overcoming my tech phobe. So here I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. So though I've just been appointed chair of the Scientific Advisory Group, which is an honour, I won't talk very much about science. I'll talk about contradictions conflict, priorities, politics, and I'll be relatively brief. So Jacqueline, if you could move on a bit, thank you. Belfast was one of the first WHO healthy cities 40 years ago. I was healthy city coordinator in Liverpool at the time. I think there were about 8 cities involved. What I really wanted just to emphasize here is that the frameworks that were evolved over many years, I think still have resonance. I remember there was a lot of talk at WHO and also to an extent in the UK about the wider determinants of health. And you may recall the Dahlgren and Whitehead rainbow of layered influences, layered determinants of public health. What Barton and Grant did was to adapt this famous rainbow into a map of place and of cities. And you can see the global ecosystem there at the outside and natural environments inside. And I recall at the time, there was quite a lot of conceptual conflict between the global ecosystem. It was the aftermath or the beginning of that climate change discussion that came out of the Rio conference, was that 92, something like that, and a more localized natural environment. And you can see there the natural habitat, much talk about green and blue spaces, if you like. I won't go into the academic literature on that. I think that's been well done by our 2 previous speakers, and also your work, Ruth, too. So this, I think, is a very helpful distillation of those layered influences on public health in our cities. If we can move on, Jacqueline. As Ruth said, a lot of my work recently has been on age-friendly cities. This 20 years ago, really, an inspirational paradigm spreading like wildfire to cities across the globe. It has political resonance. A lot of the mayors of cities on continental Europe were particularly impressed by it. And the petals focus on attributes of an ideal city. It came out of the 2007 Global Age-Friendly Cities Guide. Moving on, please. What we did in the Healthy Aging Task Force, and Belfast was involved, and Jacqueline's predecessors were involved, 3 dimensions of healthy city: physical, social, and service environments. And you can see they are multicolored here. So they contribute to the intrinsic capacity of people over their life course. They make older people healthier. So you arrive in older age because of interventions, investments in these domains. And work, once you have reached older age in these domains, increases the sense of belonging of older people of every health status. A lot of the academics call it, Amartya Sen and others, Martha Nussbaum, capability. So you may well be disabled, but if the environment is supportive of you, then your functional ability, WHO calls it, and maybe others too, is enhanced. So your environment interacts with your intrinsic capacity to deliver functional capability. Moving on. And it was adopted. I suppose I've been concerned over my many years and frustrated that cities often choose the flavor of the month, or they select a number of projects or programs. I'm always very keen that it's organized into some kind of structure, really. And here you've got, I think it's Newcastle. So you've got the model at the center. You've got left of all an understanding of the baseline, if you like, the demographics and the deprivation. map, and on the right you've got what they are doing, but in the middle you've got some kind of structure. And I was always impressed by Belfast Initiative, that they were relatively structured. It wasn't flavour of the month. It was an enduring project that lasted a long time and is still vibrant. Moving on, please. This is interesting. I mean, it reflects back on Aoife's patriarchal take. I always think that there is a tension between what I call the growth coalition in a city and the health and social care coalition. And it's quite gendered. So the growth coalition is dominated by men, and they would argue that cities need to be economically prosperous, they need to be dynamic economically, and they must depend very heavily on traffic flows. And if you take the example of Belfast, with its many highways and roads and 6-lane carriageways, then I think a lot of it is emblematic of that growth coalition, if you like. If we're able to reduce traffic flows, as in the second cut at the bottom here, this is in Milan, in Italy, then of course social interaction increases. And here are some older people walking down a street that mercifully is free of cars. So walkable streets increase social contact and improve mental health. Moving on. So thank you, Ruth. I have been involved most recently in the research and development of a brief on city leadership for age-friendly communities in the post-pandemic era. So this was co-production by WHO and 16 member cities of the Healthy Aging Task Force, of which, of course, Belfast is one, but it stretches across Europe from the smallest of the 16 cities, Horsens in Denmark, to Barcelona, which was mentioned earlier. And there were 5 lessons from city leadership during this pandemic, and they resonate really across all health emergencies. And I was very keen on the cover of this report to highlight real people rather than something taken off a kind of Google whatever. And here you've got older people lobbying the Minister of Health in Novi Sad in Serbia. So you can see the logos of the cities there. So yes, the argument I would make is that co-production is good. The production of knowledge doesn't simply rest in universities, that a lot of people working on the ground, people like Jacqueline and others, have themselves distilled knowledge of working the system. Moving on, please. This is interesting. Tensions and trade-offs during the pandemic. On the right, Horsens, they had this slogan, together but apart. And this, I think, illustrates how the social connections engendered in the park, in a nice social environment, green spaces, had a tension with keeping apart because of the pandemic and the risk of infection. And you can see it also in Udine, northern Italy, also in that photo on the left there. So, though I talked right at the beginning about the layered determinants of health, there are also conflicts in real life, and I think these 2 photographs illustrate that. Moving on, please. And here, very interestingly, a walking pharmacy in Vienna. So Stephen talked about social prescribing, and green spaces were part of a large part of the portfolio that he was talking about. And Stephen, here we have an exemplar of the kind of work you're doing, but in Vienna. So not going to the pharmacy for pills, but doing walking. So they called it a walking pharmacy. Moving on finally, I think, to the penultimate slide. In my own city, Sheffield, one has to talk about the realpolitik. I mentioned earlier the kind of patriarchy, the growth coalition, if you like, versus often in conflict with the caring or health coalition. This, interestingly, is a park recently developed in the centre of Sheffield. This was going to be a series of office blocks, but it was converted into a park. The park was developed, but only 3/4 of the land available was developed into a park. And the municipality and its leaders are faced with a difficult choice. Do they take the benefits of selling off the land for the remaining third, which would amount to £4 or £5 million, or do they invest more in the park? The Growth Coalition might say, invest in the office blocks. The Care and Health Coalition might say, invest more in the park. There can be a meeting of minds because I think the rents of the office blocks are enhanced by being able to overlook the park. So there is the possibility of some kind of partnership and coalition and common purpose. And finally, who decides on this? Is it the municipality? Is it the private sector? Are they in tension? How do you do the business? And that, I think, has vexed me for all my working life, if you like, with WHO. Sometimes we get really good policy. The science says to us, just to finalise, that there is a link between green spaces and health. But what is the realpolitik? Can more green spaces be developed? And I think Aoife covered some of the difficulties and contradictions and politics of it. So that's me, I think, a shorter one. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Lots to think about. I've heard you talk before about the realpolitik. It's always a kind of challenge, I think, to researchers to, the kind of, so what, you've found X, Y, Z, how can you actually use that to make a change and make a difference? So, no, thank you for that. And thank you, speakers, for all keeping to time. We've got plenty of time for discussion. So if Aoife and Stephen can, and Jacqueline as well, can switch their cameras back on, we can have a bit of a discussion. And Jacqueline, you're very welcome to join in on this too. I'm sure you've got plenty of experience and things to say as well with the work you're doing. I might start off with a few more general questions that cut across all three presentations, and then we'll maybe delve into some of the individual presentations and some of the questions coming through in the Q&A. And I know we're not going to get through everything in the Q&A, so if I can encourage the speakers to try and respond in the Q&A as well, just so everybody who's been brave enough to ask a question gets a response, that would be great. I guess my first question is thinking about, the title of this webinar was around inclusion, and that can mean very many kind of different things. So just thinking about, the three particular topics you've all discussed today, what does inclusive green space actually mean from your perspective and in practice, not necessarily thinking about it in terms of theory? I don't know, Stephen, if you want to start with that one in terms of from the work that you were doing, how you used that term and defined that term, inclusion.
So I think inclusion was really the driver behind why the programme, not ourselves as the evaluators, but the programme implementers, decided that was an important thing to implement was inclusive and green space in particular, as I touched on in the presentation, it's a contentious issue for people experiencing homelessness, especially the kind of overt homeless where people are potentially living in hostels, for example. So hostels, a lot of hostels in Edinburgh will have limits on when you can be in the hostel, so you'll be outside during the day and allowed back in at night. So a lot of the time they will be struggling to find somewhere to be, and a lot of the time they'll be in local urban green spaces where they'll feel that sense of conflict with the wider population or the general population, whether it's overt or just kind of a perception, whether actively being moved on or it just feels like they're not welcome. And I think the programme itself was designed to try and give people a space where they definitely felt safe. So that was the kind of real big positive of the garden space. And again, it's quite context specific. We know that the majority of primary care practices don't have a garden that can be done in. So I think they really kind of played to that strength in this space. And yeah, I think letting people, through the other activities that maybe didn't take off as well, the nature walks and branching out, was really to try and to let people know that these spaces are for you as well. It's and give them that positive experience, albeit with the support of link workers or activity coordinators. That maybe is a crucial aspect to letting people enjoy that space for this particular population group.
Yeah, brilliant, Stephen. Thank you. And Aoife, then from your perspective, how did you kind of, I guess, define that term inclusion in practice for your work?
I think through the radical feminist lens, which is about dismantling the patriarchy altogether and starting with whole new systems, it takes a stance of trying to understand what inclusion means for different communities. So it's a very place-based and community-focused definition, and it would chop and change depending on the people that would be engaging. I think there are, particularly in a city where there's a greater diversity of different cultures as well, inclusion for some people can mean having privacy in public space. And understanding that they're not too exposed, whereas for others it might be being very, very public and always out in the open and never in concealed spaces. So I think there are many different things that would come out of or develop through those co-design processes, where the people leading them genuinely listen and learn and then meaningfully take action in the direction that's specific to that community and that place.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And Jeff?
I remember the people in Newcastle, Barbara Douglas, who led for a time on their healthy aging group, said that of older people, they not only need to be listened to, but acted upon. Otherwise, my cluttered wisdom really can't cope with the question, so I pass.
I think though, I think what you're saying is very much at the heart of all this. It's not just a case of doing that engagement piece and doing the kind of active listening, but it's also then what you do with that information that comes out the other side in terms of particular actions, or with Stephen's work, particular intervention or policy. So I take the point that you're making. I guess thinking about this in another way, in terms of who's currently missing, if we think about our green spaces, our parks, our public spaces, who do we think is missing from those spaces, and what's the kind of biggest barrier in terms of them being excluded or keeping them out? I wonder, Aoife, can we start with you on that one?
Yeah, I think my research particularly focused on the nighttime, as you know, and I think there are broader issues with the way our society schedules things. So the difficulty of only having access to maybe public space at night for health reasons or for social or leisure reasons because you're working during the day, means that if that social space or public space isn't designed for you, then you're out. And that becomes a really big public health issue, where people just simply can't access the outside beyond certain hours. And there is certain control over when they do access it, how they behave or how they dress or how they act, who they're with, and so on. And so I think these control measures need to be looked at in order to improve access for women and girls, particularly, but I think it's all other genders outside of the male default.
And just thinking about that, even, and the focus of your work particularly being at night, how do we design these spaces, particularly thinking about green spaces or public spaces, that they feel safe at night but without them becoming, say, overly surveilled or hostile? Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there are many general design measures, like appropriate lighting is important. So lighting that is too harsh can make you feel far too exposed on the street, and it casts strange shadows, so you can't really see things moving as well. So it can be very intimidating walking down the street with lighting that's too harsh. We see this a lot in Belfast, where there's kind of motorway scale lighting on arterial routes rather than lighting that's designed, and it's a specific design position to take. I think there's a sort of maybe parochial attitude here as well on the island of Ireland and across the UK to own your piece of land, and so quite a lot of the boundaries try to enclose gardens and things as much as possible. So then when you have eyes that could potentially be on the street in the living spaces, you can't actually see them, or they can't see you, because hedges are so high and walls are high and fences and gates and so on. And so there are places that have policies around that. In Germany, they do it a lot, in Holland, to keep those low so that they're at seating level. Then you also generate a little bit of activity with people hanging out there. So I think there's some attitudinal shifts that need to happen so that we maybe live more collectively and out in the open together and sort of take collective responsibility across urban neighbourhoods. But I think there are strategic infrastructural things that are about the lighting. Police presence increasing the research doesn't suggest that helps much at all. But more activity, more women being out in the street, the research shows that generates more women out in the street as well. So starting small with these general things would help. Okay.
Great, thank you. And Jeff, just thinking back to that question about who is currently missing from our green spaces, our parks, public spaces, and what you think is maybe the biggest barrier that's excluding people.
I don't know about the biggest barrier, but I do have a really good, interesting case study, if you like. I did mention Pounds Park in my presentation. That's a recent development in the last 5 years, but prior to that, the City Council pushed the idea of the Peace Gardens, which is just adjacent to our town hall. And that development was very much opposed by the Green Party, who I have a lot of time for, because it meant the felling of a number of trees. But it was quite a barren grassland with about 5 trees on it. And what they developed was an all-singing, quite highly designed space, which still retained some grass, but it had fountains, it had seats, it had quite a lot of old Sheffield stone from the Peak District. So it was quite an architectural feature. The Liberal Democrats opposed it too. So when it came to Millennium Year 2000, they downplayed it. They were then in power and they didn't attend the ceremony. So the Greens were slightly reluctant, the Lib Dems were slightly reluctant, the Labour Party felt it was a bit compromised and lost a degree of brio. But brilliant. It's been brilliant, really. And What it raises for me is that it's so inclusive. So I go there to eat my pork sandwich, or probably not, vegetarian, and I sit next to a lot of other people from different minority groups. The kids play in the fountain. It's very, very inclusive of all Sheffield's diversity. So turning what seemed to be a green space with trees to something like this architecturally has transformed and included so many more people. It's not pushing people away, it's an attraction. So instead of going on a bus or in your car to the Peak District, which is only 10 miles away, you come into the city centre. And sometimes in the city centre, they convert it into a seaside. So you don't have to go to a seaside. You can come into the park. It's got water. The kids paddle. That's inclusive for me.
And Jeff, is there any resources that you can point to that, because I'm sure everybody listening would want to find out a bit more about that case study you've given. Is there any resources that you can point to that we can find out more?
Well, I think I would say more that it was political courage to do it in the face of a lot of opposition. The resources available at that time, I'm not sure what they were. I think it was a partnership with central government and so on. And there is some new money coming along for the UK. I don't know about the Republic. I mean, one has to. I think you have to have a vision. You have to have courage. You have to do the business as best you can. And sometimes the evidence is the scientific evidence. It's good, and the connection's good between green space and health. But applying it to an architectural design feature, how do you do it? It takes a lot of partners, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And Stephen, just that question then to you about thinking about who's currently missing from green space park public spaces, and what you think maybe is one of the biggest barriers for exclusion.
I mean, in the context of this programme, the biggest barrier, I've just answered the question actually in the chat that was related to this, around the biggest barrier in the service users to accessing the programme was the structured nature of the programme. So people experiencing homelessness typically have quite chaotic lifestyles. So if you give someone a nature prescription that says, at 2 o'clock on Tuesday next week, you've got a session, a nature walk booked in. A lot can happen in the space of a few days in that person's life that means that they won't turn up. So, I mean, we had people attending the garden who were then referred on to branching out, and we were there collecting some data, and one of the guys he was so enthusiastic about branching out. I think he was going to be leading the group, so he was kind of talking about it. But then came to the day and he wasn't there because something else had happened, and that was really the typical story. And that's why in the garden, the drop-in style, even though there was supposed to be there is a formal referral process to the garden. That's very much, you can turn up at any time and the referral can be done on the spot by the activity coordinator. And that seemed to work much, much better for people because they didn't have to stick to rigid timelines. I don't know how that extrapolates up to just wider public green space use in this population group, but definitely for accessing nature prescribing programmes, keeping it as low barrier as possible and as flexible as possible seemed to be the way to go.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. We'll take a few specific questions for the speakers from the Q&A. So Jeff, if I can start with you. We've got one here. So somebody who really liked the example of the walk-in pharmacy that you gave, but they're unsure how we could really pull it off, thinking about UK Ireland weather context. So do you think there are particular difficulties in designing or implementing, particularly thinking about age inclusive activities in our kind of rainier cities?
Gosh, I can't go into I mean, for me, it just symbolised possibilities, really. And it relates back to Stephen's point, really, doesn't it? That you could do something different from pills and injections and going to hospitals? And is your correspondent saying, for older people, it might be difficult because the weather isn't so good? I mean, I'm an older guy, I just put on a Mac. Come on.
Very good. I thought you might say that. Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways around it, isn't there, in terms of trying to encourage people to get out and enjoy the outdoors and the great green and blue spaces that we do have, particularly around our city centres. And another one, Jeff, then just thinking about somebody here asking about what would be the key recommendation that we should be bringing to urban planners in our city for ensuring our cities are age inclusive. So how can we really start that conversation? Have you any tips from some of the work that you've been doing, trying to move from that kind of research into action space?
I often call it the valley of death between the policy community and the research community, which we need to bridge. And I think that WHO can help do that. WHO is not a research outfit, really. What it does is distill the evidence, not using traditional medical public health models, double-blind controlled trials and so on, systematic review. You're familiar with that, I know, but more synthesizing the evidence and turning it into frameworks and turning it into priorities. So it's not simply a list of possibilities that you can do, but some structured thing, really, and then putting a budget to it. I know that a lot of cities have done, haven't they? What they call it, something budgeting. There's a name for it, which I forget. So the community comes out and says, okay, these are the options. This is the overall framework we have. Let's put a price to that kind of intervention. And where can we find the money? And do we compromise on investments in other spheres in order to put it into this sphere? Do we put it into a park or do we put it into a motorway? Unfortunately, Belfast has put it into motorways, but you do have some good parks also. So clearly, if in the round you were to take a view, it would be a kind of balance ticket, wouldn't it? I'm not sure I've answered the question.
Yeah, no, I think you have. I think you have. And it's tricky. I think it's it is a real challenge in terms of the research that we do. One, that it's the kind of the right research at the right time to try and address that particular problem that needs addressed at that time. But then once you've done that research, the challenge is how do you actually make it useful? I think it is a real challenge, and I think something that we're all continually trying to learn how to do better. So no,
I think someone like you goes out on a limb and does it, but I think for a lot of researchers who want a career, to get your research article in an American journal that will be read by very few people, but has a number of complicated concepts and language, that is the way you become a professor. If you actually do the business and make those translations, then you're not often preferred. So they are tensions, I think, for researchers, aren't they?
Yeah, no, absolutely. They're quite different things, quite different pathways, I think. And I agree with you. There's certainly a tension there. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Aoife, a couple of questions for you, and thank you. You've been answering away in the Q&A, but I'll maybe pick up on a couple of them that you can maybe go into a bit more detail on. And one was, do you think purpose-built strategic infrastructure that directly aims to improve usage among women is a viable solution, or do we think the emphasis needs to be on spaces that are accessible and inclusive for all? I'm sure that's something you've been challenged with it a few times in this type of work. I wonder, could you just reflect on that?
I think spaces that work, excuse me, for women are spaces that work for everyone. I think when you take a feminist perspective on this, it is about inclusivity. And I think when you think about system overhaul and more matriarchal agendas, they're not about women leading. They're about everybody understanding that we have to work together to change the face of what's happening. So I think infrastructure is a very good word that was used in that the person's question. It needs to be infrastructural. I think if there's vulnerable patches where positive interventions haven't happened and there's a disconnected infrastructure across the city, then you could worsen a situation. So I think overall strategies that are women focused will benefit everybody. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I guess just building on that, and again, maybe just picking up on one of the answers you've given, can maybe go into in a wee bit more details. Think, you talked about that restructuring of existing systems, and what does that, I guess conceivably or realistically, look like, or what can be achieved there, particularly thinking about promoting inclusion, removing those barriers that we know kind of exacerbate inequalities.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what will work, but I'm hoping to find out. I think probably if there were real meaningful engagement processes that were designed around a co-design framework, I think that's probably a step forward. But that would have to be supported by the government systems and policies. I mean, this ends up being kind of, I suppose, capitalist realism, where you think that it's happening because it looks like it's happening, but actually it's still trying to operate within a system that doesn't really appreciate it happening. So it ends up being style over substance. So I think the co-design process will hopefully help us find out the best way to engage and the best way to connect that to meaningful action in the form of policy and legislation, because that's the only way it will happen. I mean, and from my perspective, as an architect in practice, there's so much heavy legislation. Your job is entirely administrative. You get very little time to design, and so unless you have that support structure through there that directs people entirely towards a process that's mapped out and clear and has a law behind it, I think that's the only way it would change ultimately.
Sorry to
Yeah.
interject, but is your proposition about universal design always true? So I remember doing something, is a healthy city an age-friendly city, or is an age-friendly city a healthy city? And surely there must be some kind of tensions. And I remember going to Manchester, and there was a guy there did a research on the old moat neighbourhood and the issue of park benches. So you would think that a park bench would be great for older people want to sit down, but the reality was the older people said that younger people congregated around them and caused a fairly toxic environment. So it wasn't a universal design, it was potentially conflict. And is that the case with some of the design issues, that there may be conflicts between different users?
Absolutely. And I think that's the reason there needs to be a place-based solution. Like, it needs to be context driven. And so in terms of design and engagement process, or trying to understand the best methods to engage with a community, it needs to be really place specific. There needs to be investment and time investment and return into the community, and trying to get underneath all of those social parameters, which manifest themselves in the built environment in a multitude of different ways, so that you don't put the bench in every location where the bench isn't the best solution, but actually you speak to the people and try to understand the everyday nuances of the place, to design an engagement process that works for that particular place. I think part of the co-design methodology through a feminist lens is about trying to get all different types of people, an intersectional perspective of people in the room, and maybe not just one room, but different engagement measures that, like the Minecraft model, that allow lots of people to engage in this, with the hope that you would capture as many nuances of the area as possible. So you don't act into a space that you don't fully understand. You invest time and energy, and you learn those particular specific aspects.
Great.
So you're
Thank
confident
you.
that you don't finish up with a bland lowest common denominator.
Well, I'm hoping not. I'm hoping not. I'm hoping that what will come out of this is a solution that can be applied to welcome the dynamism of different places, and that will understand that there isn't a one size fits all, and that you have to move and shake with the measures of the place. But you start with the experts of the place, which is the people that live there and work there and play there, and you grow from that point.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you. No, thank you. Thank you for that, Aoife and Jeff. Stephen, if I can move to a question for you, particularly, you mentioned in your talk about, how do we actually measure, if some of these programs are actually making a difference and having an impact. So I wonder, could you say just a wee bit more about what you're thinking about in terms of what some of those measures might be, or how we kind of can think through what to usefully measure?
So, I mean, I think this is the thing that in public health research we're really kind of interested in, and the evaluation by Haywood and colleagues used ONS4 across the NHS green social prescribing sites, and the feedback they got was that it was quite difficult to administer that questionnaire. If anyone's not familiar with it, it's 4 very short questions on 1 to 10 scale that measure personal wellbeing aspects. It was very difficult for link workers who were just kind of, it's always the same case where the burden to collect the data falls on the deliverers of the programme at the same time. And on the one hand, that's something you want to try and test, because if it's going to be a sustainable programme that you continuously monitor, you want it to be someone who's able to do that alongside the programme. It's good to get external evaluation in at points to do robust evaluation, but you want the data collection ideally to be part of the wider programme. So in terms of what to measure, I think well-being, some aspect of mental or personal well-being is always important, and it's a thing that, the mechanism is there under which green social prescribing and mental well-being and nature connection are known to be linked. In terms of the homeless angle, we didn't think there was any point in measuring nature connection, given the complexity around the relationship with nature. So, if someone's sleeping outside, they might indicate they're quite connected to nature, but it's not good for their health necessarily. However, we were quite interested in the activation measure, so that's health confidence. So a lot of the time, these types of programs will be looking to try and boost people's confidence in how they self-manage their health. So people experiencing homelessness, especially some subpopulations in there, so people with substance use issues, example, will have quite poor confidence in how they manage their own health. They'll be quite reliant on primary care, secondary care, emergency care. And programs like this, there's quite a big potential around them to, kind of forget about the green space angle for 1 second, having people engage in positively in a space where you can maybe implement small interventions around that. So social work interventions, once they've built the trust and rapport, to maybe prevent some of that healthcare use. That can be really, really vital. So measuring things like activation, mental well-being, personal well-being, things like social interaction as well are quite important in this population group. And yeah, using validated scales is always good. One of the interesting bits of feedback we've had from intervention developers is they wanted to measure people's mood before and after a session, which does it at the face of it, we were like, well, that's fine, but from a public health perspective, if someone's mood increases for an hour and then goes back to baseline, what much use is that from a public health perspective? But after a wee bit of discussion with them, that issue of trust came up again, and it was kind of, the rationale was that if they can improve someone's mood who's really not receptive to the health intervention they need at the start of the programme, if they can then, at the end of the programme, their mood's improved and their rapport's improved enough to then say, do you want to just have a quick chat about this? I mean, that could translate into public health relevant outcomes. So yeah, we're kind of, it's very early stages at the Access Place in terms of building these in. We're just really testing the feasibility of can it be collected? Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. I mean, it's clearly something you're given a lot of thought to, and as you say, trying to see what's feasible, test out different measures, different indicators, and see what's useful, particularly I guess for trying to measure impact, but also usefully inform kind of policy and practice too. Okay, thank you everybody. I'm very conscious of time, and we've had almost an hour and a half of your time, so I just want to finish by thanking all the speakers, Stephen, Aoife, and Jeff. It's been really interesting just to see, that kind of breadth of how we can think about inclusion, particularly in our green spaces, our public spaces for different communities, and also thinking particularly about that action piece. How do we take that research and that challenge from Jeff in terms of how we take that research and do something useful and meaningful with it. There will be a follow-up email coming, which will have the recording of the video. We'll make all the recordings available from the series. We are in the planning stage of some future webinars that will take place later in the year. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for those coming out. We're now kind of moving into that final year of the Groundswell Consortium, which is a range of different research, particularly around green and blue spaces for health and inequalities. So you'll be seeing more from us coming out over the next year. So thank you everybody. Thanks in particular to Jacqueline for your help in organising this, and thanks again to the speakers and also for all the great questions. And I think we'll leave it there. So thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.